pick back up on, right? Starting in Zechariah 13:14. So, Zechariah, a tough scroll to tackle, and really would require weeks for anybody and I'm not claiming to be an expert by no means, but just basically at the novice level to get more than just a simple familiarization with it. And unfortunately, we don't have that kind of time. And here we're looking at the closing chapters of this scroll, but just a few things to make sure that we're helping our students get a better feel for is where does the events of this scroll coincide with respect to what's going on in the post-exilic period. Over the last 2 weeks, we've been looking at material from Daniel moving on into Ezra, and as we just started to touch on Ezra, we're looking at the first wave of exiles that are coming back under the proclamation Cyrus the Persian, who is ruling Persia at the time when Babylon is conquered, is giving the edict for them to be able to go back to their homeland and to start rebuilding the wall, the city. Over the course of the sequence of events with respect to Ezra and Nehemiah, most of those events are already done by the time Ezra and Nehemiah come back to the city. So with that, when we're looking at the words of Zechariah, when do these transpire? We have to take this from resources mostly outside of Zechariah to pin it down with a fair degree of accuracy. So Zechariah and Haggai are those prophets that are ministering around the time Zerubbabel, the Davidic descendant who has been appointed as the Persian governor. By that I just simply mean Persian recognized governor over the area, and Jeshua, the Aaronic descendant or high priest. And so this is pretty close to the first wave of exiles that have come back. So many of the events that will transpire in the post-exilic period have yet to actually occur, right? What I mean by that is you have the events of Malachi, they have yet to occur. The whole entirety of the book of Esther has yet to occur because Cyrus is, again, the ruling monarch of the time, and Xerxes, as most scholars accept, is the Persian monarch who is married to Esther at the time of the events of that particular book, which is actually a whole different dynasty, the dynasty that succeeds the dynasty that Cyrus is ruling in. And so it's hard to keep those things nailed down and precise in our minds because a lot of times I think when we read the book of Esther, we're just assuming there are no Jews back in the actual land of Israel, but that isn't the case at all. Not only are Jews back in the land of Israel at the time of the events of Esther, but they've already rebuilt the temple. They've already rebuilt the wall. So that will have some bearing on what we'll talk about tonight if we have a chance to get to that. So just spend some time trying to pin out the sequence of events as best you can. Spend a little time in some commentative works to try to help pin these things down for you, because if you can do that, it will pay dividends for your students. Maybe write that up on a dry erase board in your class if you've got one, just as a quick rudimentary timeline so they know when these prophets are speaking and, again, when these events are transpiring. So we have the first 4 verses of chapter 13 to deal with, the first 11 verses of chapter 14. I'm just going to briefly read a few of those verses from both chapters, and then we'll start commenting. So beginning with chapter 13, on that day will be opened for the house of David and for the residents of Jerusalem to wash away sin and impurity. I'm sorry, I think I missed this word. On that day, a fountain will be opened for the house of David. So the first thing that we should be asking and attempting to try to answer is, what does that word or phrase mean, on that day? Naturally, because this is a chapter break, its definition is going to be predicated on the material that comes immediately before this. So we have to back up to chapter 12. You have a subheading in most of your translations that will divide verses 9 and 10. In verse 10, we start off with probably one of those verses that many of us are more familiar with from Zechariah than we are other passages, and that being the fact that there is one who is recognized to have been pierced by his own people, and a spirit of, as it says in the King James, of supplication, or in the CSB, a spirit of grace and prayer will be poured out on the house of David. So I'll just read verse 10. Then I will pour out a spirit of grace and prayer on the house of David and the residents of Jerusalem. They will look at me whom they've pierced. But who is the first person pronoun there? With respect to that verse, we go back to the beginning of the chapter. Verse 1 of chapter 12, a pronouncement, the word of the Lord concerning Israel. And then it goes on in verse 2, look, I will make Jerusalem a cup that causes staggering for the peoples who surround the city. So the first person pronoun in verse 2 would be who? Who is the one who will make Jerusalem a cup that causes staggering for the peoples? Yahweh, right? Exactly. So that doesn't change in context. And even when we get down to verse 10, it's also Yahweh who is saying, then I will pour out a spirit of grace, and they will look at me, whom they've pierced. We can clearly recognize that this has messianic overtones, considering the fact that Jesus was indeed pierced. But just setting that aside for a brief second to try to appreciate the larger construct of what Zechariah is working through here, going back to the beginning of this chapter, we have a time in which apparently there's going to be a siege of sorts laid against Jerusalem. Peoples are going to come and fight. It is said the nations are going to come, and God is going to give them a cup to drink of, and it's going to cause them to stagger. Great confusion is going to be poured out amongst them. Zechariah is invoking language that is all too familiar with many of these pre-exilic prophets that speak to how God pours out day of wrath or day of the Lord kind of judgment against Israel's enemies. So when is this? Presumably, the way many of us have been taught, we see this as being more or less an end of the age or an end of time sort of thing. I think there's probably two reasons why we think that. Number one, if Zechariah is a post-exilic prophet, that means, as goes the sequence of biblical events, we're looking forward to the time of Jesus. And, of course, the beginning of the church age. So most of those things are going to transpire somewhere between 30 AD-ish until the end of the first century. And if we can't find anything that succinctly describes what Zechariah is talking about, then we have a tendency to assume those events are going to be still future yet for us. And also because of the words of chapter 14, which we'll get to here in just a second. But again, let's go back a little bit further here and look at the context of chapter 11. Chapter 11 actually speaks to the idea of Zechariah dressing down these corrupt shepherds who are leading Israel. God has a very stern word for them, the fact that they have used, abused, and oppressed His people. Now the question is how does this marry up with respect to the time that Zechariah is ministering in? There's not a lot of information in the Scripture itself that speaks to what's going on during this time period and what is the spiritual and political climate like, except for the books of Ezra and Nehemiah. And we know there are some sin problems they struggle with, failing to honor the Sabbath, as opposed to keeping the streets in the city clear of any and all mercantile trade and whatnot. The people are there selling their wares, and Nehemiah has to literally lock the city gates so people won't come in and do that sort of thing. So there's issues with respect to observing some of the most basic commands of the law of Moses. And we also know there are issues with people giving loans with exuberant interest rates that lead them to have to start selling their people into slavery in order to cover the charges for all these things. There are some problems. But Zechariah is also opening up a little bit of an earlier understanding of what problems were like for the immediate wave of exiles that went back and began to reestablish or resettle the area. And as he's talking about the oppressiveness of these shepherds, he himself is postured as a shepherd who sadly is rejected by the people. Now that should sound somewhat familiar, the motif of a shepherd who is rejected by his own and is sorely undervalued for 30 pieces of silver. We'll get to that here in just a second. I'm going to back up to chapter 9, and really this is where the concourse starts for us. I would highly encourage all of you, if you're going to be teaching chapters 13 and 14, you need to start back in chapter 9 and read the entirety of chapters 9 through 14 before you start trying to carve out what your lesson's going to be, because all of this is written with this sequence in mind, okay? So if we're just simply trying to teach from chapter 13, 14 without a good grasp on the context, we're going to miss a lot of the points that Zechariah is making. So I'm going to try to break this down as simple as I can and as quickly as I can, which I hope doesn't undermine it or short sell it too much, but nonetheless, working with the time that we have. So in chapter 9, I think the subheading is a good way of grasping this. If we read through just these first few verses here, we're going to see the judgment pronounced by Zechariah on Zion's enemies. Now, the funny thing about this, though, is that at the time Zechariah is speaking these oracles and eventually these words are going to be written down. Most of these peoples do not exist in the form that they did prior to the exile. Babylon, when they came through, they were like a wrecking ball. They destroyed all of these kingdoms, and even though Cyrus has let remnants of these survivors go back to their homelands, they're not going to be creating kingdoms again like they had prior to the time of even Assyria. So talking about those people who are settling in Ashkelon, because ancient cities like Ashkelon, one of the more prominent cities of the Philistines, or Damascus, and whatnot, even though they are going to be population centers once again, and really never were quite emptied out of all their people. Fact is, they're not going to be the centers of great kingdoms again. But Zechariah is talking about them as if he was an Isaiah figure pronouncing judgment against these peoples. Why is that? I think one of the reasons is we need to see this poetically and symbolically for what it is. Zechariah is speaking about the future that still lay in store for God's people, and the fact that these ancient enemies, because Ashkelon being a Philistine city, Damascus an Assyrian city, we know the Philistines and the Assyrians are some of the more prominent enemies that Israel has had in her past. So he's using these as figures to figuratively speak about the enemies that the people of Zion have now, which of course are the Persians, later on going to be the Greeks, and of course up until the time of Jesus, the Romans. And for all of these kingdoms, all of these empires, the fate will be the same. God is going to defend his people. God is going to destroy these enemies. And from the wreckage of it all, God is going to preserve humanity alongside the seed of Abraham that he's covenanted with. This is important for us because when we get to Zechariah 9:9, what do we find? Probably the verse that we're all most familiar out of Zechariah, because it's reiterated several times in the gospel narratives. Rejoice greatly, daughter Zion. Shout in triumph, daughter Jerusalem. Look, your king is coming to you. He is righteous. He's victorious. He's humble. He's riding on a donkey, on a colt, the foal of a donkey. We know those words are seen by every one of the gospel writers to be fulfilled in the coming of Jesus as he enters into Jerusalem, the beginning of the Passion Week, that starts with him being lauded and, of course, ends with him being exalted, but not actually being installed as a king in the proper sense on a throne with a crown, a scepter, a diadem, all that stuff. Instead, he's being exalted as a king in the most humiliating way possible, with nails in his hands, a crown of thorns on his head, being ridiculed and mocked by Israel's leaders, and of course, even abandoned by God on Calvary's mountain. But here's the thing, and I would obviously encourage you first and foremost to try to first situate this in the context that it's speaking to before we just start making immediate New Testament applications and links. However, in the short time frame I have to kind of do that with you. And secondly, I think it's almost inevitable that you're going to do that as teachers. What I mean by that is when we read the first 11 verses of chapter 14, we start reading that passage about God coming back to earth, or coming to earth, and setting his feet on Mount Zion, the mountain itself quaking, cleaving in two, separating into two halves, one to the north and south, and a great valley that doesn't exist there now being created that spreads east and west, and then the exaltation of the city of Jerusalem. And of course, just about every one of us has heard that being taught or preached as a passage that directly connects to Acts chapter 1 with Jesus returning, as those two angels told his disciples, in like manner from which you saw him ascend into heaven. But the question is that really the context that Zechariah is operating in? And second to that, when we see gospel writers starting to help us understand how these passages from Zechariah fit in to the passion narrative of Jesus, it should give us great cause to take a pause, a big step back, maybe 2 steps back, and see the entirety of the scope of chapters 9 through 14 in light of the gospel narrative, and whether or not there are more details that sync up there than just Jesus entering into the city riding on the back of a donkey, okay? In Zechariah's language here, talking about a king entering triumphantly into a city, he's speaking about this in the kind of terms that the salvation he brings are from Israel's enemies in a militant way. And of course, that gives rise to the very expectation that these first century Jews had, that Messiah would rescue them from the torment of the Romans. However, Jesus has just spent the last 3 years in his ministry with his own disciples and anybody else who will listen to his lessons, helping them turn all of those expectations on their head. As he's fulfilled prophecies in a direct way, yet they're asking questions like, why does Elijah have to come first? And he's saying, look, John is Elijah if you will hear and accept that fact. In other words, the expectations that they have and the way that they're all fulfilled in many cases are exactly what God meant in those previous prophetic passages. The way they're fulfilled, though, just wasn't quite the way that those people who are watching these things unfold in space and time ever actually thought they would go down. So Jesus is entering triumphantly into the city of Jerusalem to bring salvation and to deliver Israel from her enemies. But her enemies are not her Roman oppressors. Her enemies are not even the oppressive shepherds, her political and religious leaders that rule over her from her own people. Her enemies, of course, are sin, the very thing that keeps us all enslaved and in bondage, right? And then all of those other oppressors will eventually fall in line as God's kingdom begins to grow out of the movement that Jesus is about to start in Jerusalem. He is coming into the city gates to be coronated as a king, but again, not with a golden crown covered in jewels. He's coming to be coronated as king with a crown of thorns. His exaltation as king is going to be through his humiliation. If you don't quite understand what I mean, then let's go back to John 3 for a second. When Jesus is talking to Nicodemus and he speaks to the example of Moses lifting up the bronze serpent in the wilderness, and he speaks to himself being lifted up, what is he talking about? John tells us very clearly. He's speaking about his death on the cross. But using the term lifted up carries us back to Isaiah 6. What's going on in Isaiah 6? Isaiah is in the temple. When he's in the temple in this vision, who is it that he sees seated on the throne? God. What does he say about him? That he is high and lifted up. So this is all enthronement language. And John 3 is just the first of 6 uses by John exclusively using that phrase, lifted up, in which in every one of them, Jesus is talking about how he will be exalted in his death, how he will be coronated as king in his death. So, again, we need to start right here in Zechariah 9, helping our students understand this is where this narrative is carrying us by the time we get to chapters 13 and 14. We're talking about Messiah coming to do this business of his Passion Week with first riding into the city triumphantly to oust the enemies. But the enemies are not a physical kind. They are a spiritual kind, right? And of course, what's going to be the fallout of the salvation that he brings. We'll go on into chapter 10, and look what it says here in chapter 10. At the very beginning, it's a subheading, the Lord restores his people. Zechariah is going to use pre-exilic language like Isaiah and other prophets contemporary to him to speak about God kind of restoring Garden of Eden type of settings or ambiance to Jerusalem when he's speaking about bringing the rain, crops growing, all that stuff. But he also speaks about how the people wander like a sheep. They suffer affliction because there's no shepherd at the end of verse 2. In the beginning of verse 3, my anger burns against these shepherds. So I am going to punish the leaders. Now think about that. When you carry that on through the lens of the gospel writers, all 4 of them talking about Jesus entering into the city on the back of the donkey, and this is the fulfillment of Zechariah 9, what transpires over the course of the next 7 days? Is Jesus going to sit and have strategy meetings with the religious and political leaders of Israel to talk about how he's going to be bringing kingdom and ousting the Romans? What do we find him doing each of those 7 days? He goes to one place. Where is that? It's in Jerusalem. It's the temple. Every single day he's seen, spotted openly, teaching in the temple courts. Who is he dealing with during those days? All the gospel writers make it very clear. He's being harassed by the religious and political leaders. First it's the Pharisees, then it's the Sadducees, then it's the Herodians, until he shuts them all up and systematically shuts them all down so that they can't even really ask him any questions anymore because they can't stump him or trap him on anything. But considering the fact that each of these groups are the religious and political leaders, in Zechariah's terminology, they are Israel's shepherds. And it's no different in Jesus' day. When Jesus in John chapter 10 is saying, I am the good shepherd, that must mean, in contrast, there has to be a what shepherd? A bad. Who would that be? You go back to Ezekiel, and every one of these Jews who are very familiar with his writings know exactly who he's talking about, Because of all of those prophets, in the time of the exile, or at least when it's beginning, Ezekiel is the one who's shotgunning every one of these people who in Israel are the culprits for why Israel are about to be found as sheep without shepherds, because they have led them astray, they have become like wolves, they have gobbled them up, they have fattened themselves and left the sheep lean to starve. So when Jesus saying all of this, and even contrasting himself against anyone else who's come before him as King James says, a hireling or whatnot, that he's speaking about how these religious leaders, these political leaders over them are the same as those in Ezekiel's day. So the point of this is when he goes into Jerusalem, that last and final week before his crucifixion, again, to be exalted as king, he is coming to lambaste all of those people who are in control of Israel and, of course, her religious education and training, indoctrination, and their understanding of how they fit into the nations and the accomplishment of God's agenda with Israel to satisfy and fulfill the Abrahamic promise. Does that make sense so far? Are you tracking with me? So far, we've got Zechariah 9, Jesus entering into Jerusalem, Zechariah 10, Zechariah talking about God dressing down all these shepherds and his anger with them, and Jesus is spilling that vitriol out, right? 3 of the gospel writers speak of Jesus going into the temple the first day he shows up there, and he's kicking over tables, he's chasing animals out, and he's angry, So we clearly see that's what's coming out. Chapter 11, more of the same thing. He's talking about the destruction of the temple. Now, you might not readily see that, but look here with me. Verse 1, open your gates, Lebanon. Fire will consume your cedars. Wail, Cypress, for the cedar has fallen. The glorious trees are destroyed. Wail, oaks of Bashan, for the stately forest has fallen. Listen to the wail of the shepherds, for their glory is destroyed. Okay, let's work backwards through this. If the shepherds are the religious and political leaders, and we're thinking about this in both Zechariah's day and Jesus' day, then in Jesus' day, those will be people like the Sadducees and the Pharisees, and for them, the most important thing that exists on the earth is the temple. And in Zechariah's day, it's not much different. Zechariah is overseeing the building of this temple, right? Now, notice here, the mentioning of the cedars of Lebanon, which in the days of David and Solomon, those were the prized trees that they wanted to adorn their palace and what with? The temple. But notice what else is mentioned here. Cypress and other species, of course, but the oaks of Bashan. The oaks of Bashan are due east, way over on the eastern side of the Jordan River. So why 2 different regions with trees being mentioned here? Well, number 1, let's think about the cedars. Again, 1 Kings chapter 2, we got a clear understanding of why they're important because of their use in the temple. But then in Psalm 68, you have the psalmist talking about God being exalted on Mount Bashan. Mount Bashan, the very same place where these oaks come from, the place where the big giant king, Og, ruled from, and again, on the eastern side of the Jordan. What does that have to do with him except for the fact it's part of Israel? Well, simply this. If Bashan in Psalm 68 is talked about as if it's a mountain where God is exalted on and has a sanctuary on, places where God has a sanctuary, that kind of language is what kind of language? Temple language, right? You'll have to go back and read this on your own. I don't have time to expound any more than I am at the moment. But again, write that down somewhere, Psalm 68. Go and read that. And again, it incorporates temple language. So what am I saying here? It seems like Zechariah may be speaking in code here when he's talking about the destruction of places, or the place where cypress, oaks, and especially cedar trees adorn the walls. Okay, well, in the context of the gospel narratives, when Jesus is there with his disciples in the week of the Passion, toward the end of that week, he is walking with his disciples through the temple complex, observing all the buildings, and what do his disciples call his attention to? How beautiful the buildings are, right? And what does Jesus say in response to that? There will come a day in which not a single what? Stone will still be standing on another. Why? What are they going to do about it? The Romans are going to come, and they're going to completely destroy this place. So it's almost like the first 3 verses here of Zechariah 11, in keeping with all of this, is speaking about the destruction of the one prized possession of his generation. That's the construction of the temple. And the one thing that Jesus is saying is going to be the inevitable thing, fate they cannot escape in his day within a generation. all the blood spilt from Abel to Zechariah, son of Berechiah, is going to be charged, laid at their feet, and they're going to suffer. He says this in verse 4, the Lord my God says this, shepherd the flock intended for slaughter. Those who buy them slaughter them, but they're not punished. Those who sell them say, ha, blessed be the Lord, because I have become rich. Even their own shepherds have no compassion for them. But we go down to verse 7. So I, this is Zechariah speaking, shepherded the flock intended for slaughter, the oppressed of the flock. I took 2 staves, calling one favor, the other union, and I shepherded the flock. In 1 month, I got rid of 3 shepherds, presumably bad, but I became impatient with them, and they also detested me. Then I said, I'm no longer going to shepherd you. Let what's dying die. Let what's perishing perish, and let the rest devour each other's flesh. So next, I took my staff called favor, cut it in 2, annulling the covenant I made with all the peoples. It was annulled on that day. So the oppressed of the flock who were watching me knew that it was the word of the Lord. Then I said to them, if it seems right to you, give me my wages. If not, keep them. So they weighed my wages out, 30 pieces of silver. What do you have here? A shepherd who takes it upon himself to bring these oppressed sheep together and oust these shepherds who are maligning them. But what is the reaction of the sheep? They detest him. And he says, I'm not going to shepherd you anymore. So in essence, what has happened on the part of the sheep with relation to their shepherd? Have they embraced him or rejected him? What does Jesus say on the night when he's eating the supper with his disciples? What's going to happen that night? Tonight, the shepherd's going to be struck. The sheep will scatter. One of his own that he's pulled into his inner circle, who dips his bread with him in the jar on the table, is about to lift his heel up against him. And he's already conspired with the religious leaders. What does he value Jesus' life to be worth? 30 pieces of silver. And Matthew says in chapter 27, though he attributes the passage to Jeremiah, there's a complex thing going on here, and I don't have time to explain it. I would encourage you to look this up. But he quotes directly from Zechariah, not Jeremiah, when he speaks about them taking the money that his life was valued at and then throwing it to the potter. Another use of the word potter here would be treasury. What does Judas try to do with the money when he realizes he's betrayed innocent blood? Does he keep it? No, he throws it back to them. And what do they then say they can't do? They can't put it back in the treasury because it's blood money. So what do? They go and buy a field with it to bury unnamed dead. And what do they call the field? The potter's field. This is all lining up. So then we go on, chapter 12. So look, then there's supposedly going to be a siege. Now you might be saying at this point, we diverge away from the idea of this being anything to do with the gospel narrative. That could be true, but here's the thing. This is one of the reasons why I told you it's important for us to have historical synchronization as ironclad as possible. If you've never read this passage before like this, and I'm going to assume you probably haven't, because you probably have never heard this before until tonight, and I'm not trying to say that to be sensational, I'm just saying it's not a common thing to hear. If you've never read this particular passage from Zechariah 12 in the lens of the events of the book of Esther and the evil plan concocted by Haman, who wanted to destroy all the Jews, again, in the time of Esther, that would mean there are Jews living in Jerusalem with a rebuilt city and a rebuilt temple. So for them, that's their capital, is it not? It always has been. Where would be the one place that Haman would want to wipe off the map? Jerusalem, where most of these Jews have gone back to, would it not be? So having said that, the Persian emperor could not redact the law. All he could do was just arm the Jews and give them the chance to be able to defend themselves. So in the book of Esther, were there attacks on Jews where they were settled at? Yes, including Jerusalem, though it's never mentioned. Was the city potentially laid siege to? Very well may have been. Did God turn the Jews over to their enemies, or did God deliver them? He delivered them, resoundingly so, over a 2-day defeat. And it was quite the bit of spoil that came from that. So in other words, these events written by Zechariah could have been the way that God delivered Israel during the plan of Haman. I'd love to say more on that. But then that would fit us back in the time frame between Zechariah's day and Jesus' day. And then after their deliverance by the Lord, he then goes into this passage about mourning for himself or over him, the one who's been pierced. Now notice this. I would write this down if you can't remember it. There's some very close parallels here with Passover language. Think about that. There's one who's been pierced, We understand that in the vein of Jesus as being slaughtered. He's the Passover sacrifice. What happened the morning after, in the wee hours of the morning, after the actual Passover event happened in Egypt? When all of the Egyptian households, including Pharaoh's, were waking up, were they celebrating or were they grieving and mourning? Obviously grieving and mourning. Mourning as if they were for a firstborn, because which particular child in the house was targeted? The firstborn son. But this is completely inverted. It's not Egypt or foreigners mourning over a firstborn son. It's Israel. And it's not because God has slain the sons or that God has acted to slay the firstborn. They have acted to slay the firstborn. They are the ones that's killed the firstborn of God in this sense. Now, I know you might be thinking, well, man, it's already time to close us up, and we haven't hardly gotten anywhere in 13 or 14. 13, we have the opening of a fountain where water comes from. I would highly encourage you to skip the temptation here to think of this in the terms of the old but sacred hymn, "There is a fountain drawn with blood flowing from Emmanuel's veins," because this is not a fountain filled with blood. This is a fountain filled with water. And the reason why this is important is because this is why the Torah matters so much and why we should know it as the bedrock of biblical interpretation. Because the word there for impurity or sin, nidah, is considered ceremonial uncleanness. And this is the kind of water that you have in Numbers 19. The red heifer that gets killed, its body gets burnt, its ashes are mixed with water in a clean clay jar. And if a person has touched a dead body, the water has to be sprinkled on them on the third and seventh day, or else they retain their uncleanness and can never join the community again. Now is a perpetual fountain that will never be stopped up, so that anybody who has contact with the dead will be cleansed from it. But here's the thing. Right before this passage, what did we just read? The words about one being pierced. Who is that? Jesus. And he didn't just get pierced, he died, right? So in other words, coming into contact with the dead corpse of the pierced one, Jesus, is ultimately what serves as the source too of the fountain of never-ending clean water that cleanses us from all impurity. Think about this in the lens of what John says. When John said his side was pierced, what came forth? Blood and water, right? And then wrap this up in Zechariah 14. And you might be thinking, but this is that moment where you have to say this cannot be part of the gospel narrative because we have yet to have him come and put his feet back on the Mount of Olives. I wish I had another 30 minutes to go through all of this. But think of it in this way. Look at the events, read this later on your own time, and then marry this up with the gospel. Here we're talking about his feet touching the Mount of Olives, and then immediately the earth responds with an earthquake. But it's a paradox in the sense that even though the earth quakes so violently, the mountain splits. There has never been an earthquake like that we have record of, where mountains split and actually move into two separate pieces. The Mount of Olives being directly east of Jerusalem, if that was to happen, it would be a magnitude or an earthquake of such great magnitude, the entire city of Jerusalem would cease to exist. That mountain too would crumble. But Jerusalem is perfectly preserved. Those two mountain peaks are less than a mile apart. That's impossible, number one. Number two, Zechariah speaks about water flowing from the summit of Jerusalem that's going to be flowing east and west through this new chasm. But remember what was just said in this chapter about the purpose of water, its cleansing properties. He's piggybacking on that. And then secondly, there will come a time when these events happen where there will be neither day or night. Sun and moon will both be diminished or ashamed to shine. Now, can you think through an event in Jesus' life where he was on the Mount of Olives, or pretty close to it, where there was an earthquake that is spoken of as shattering every rock? There was a rending of sorts, but it wasn't the mountain itself. It was a tearing of something very important, the veil in the temple. And when he was stabbed in his side, again, what came gushing forth? Blood and... Is it possible that what Zechariah is talking about here is not what the angels in Acts 2 say, or Acts 1 about him coming back? Is it possible that in the Passion narrative, what Zechariah is actually pointing out here is Jesus' crucifixion? It's possible. It's possible. I know it's going to take some time to chew on that, to really read it, reread it, tear it apart. But I would highly encourage you, if you did nothing else over the course of the next few days, just take some time, read these accounts, pair it up with the Passion narrative of Jesus in the Gospels, all four of them, and see how many details line up. And I promise you, There are way more connections there than you think. All right, so